get in there.
Yeah, I know. He's sent to another room.
Yes, good.
Lovely.
He's such a troublemaker.
Yeah,
People flooding
it
into
just doesn't go on mute.
now. There we go. All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're a very big group, which is wonderful. Thank you for attending this evening's discussion of Damon Kitney's The Inner Sanctum, Secrets of Australia's Most Private Leaders. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand you over to our speakers this evening, I'd just like to reiterate a couple of things that were mentioned in the email that you were sent this evening with the link to tonight's event. So first of all, you've all been placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening until the end when I take you off to join me in thanking our speakers. However, we will be having a Q&A session towards the end of the evening, and the way that that will work is that I'll ask that you send your questions to me using the chat box. Now, I'll be sending you all a message there shortly with the link to purchase your copy of Damon's book. However, if you can't see it, it's towards the bottom left of your screen. You can type your question there, it'll come directly to me, and then I will read it out along with your name when I'm prompted to do so later in the evening by Carol. So the last thing that I'd like to mention before I introduce you to Carol is that at the moment on our website, we have a special offer, which is that you can receive 10% off in the next 24 hours of all orders made on our website using the code EVENT at checkout. As I mentioned, it is for 24 hours only, so I recommend getting in there soon to make your purchases. Again, I'll be posting the link to purchase the Inner Sanctum in just a couple of moments. So now I would like to introduce your moderator for the evening, Carol Schwartz. Carol is one of Australia's most dynamic business leaders with a career spanning property, the arts, finance, government and health sectors. Having been nominated as an eminent business leader by the Australian government, Carol has conducted significant inquiries on behalf of the government and chaired major government boards, as well as chairing and participating in high-level private company and listed company boards. She's regarded as one of Australia's leading spokespeople on the issues of governance, social enterprise and women's leadership. So Carol, I would now like to hand over to you to begin this evening's discussion.
Thank you so much, Emma. And welcome everybody. Thanks for attending tonight. I must say I was very, very excited when Damon asked me whether I would launch his book, and it's with great pleasure that I'm doing it. So I'd like to introduce Damon a little bit formally. So he is a financial journalist, as we all know, par excellence, who has worked for over 25 years in Australia's leading financial media organisations. Now, I have known Damon for over a decade and have the utmost respect for his journalism skills. Unlike other financial journalists, Damon is able to focus very much on the human side of business leaders, what motivates them both professionally and personally, and his empathy and insight encourages these otherwise quite private individuals to open up and share the personal aspects of their lives in a very trusting way. His book, The Inner Sanctum, is a compilation of a number of his interviews with business leaders, and I'm sure will give the reader unexpected insights into what makes these people tick. Now, I thought rather than have Damon make a little speech about his book, that we'd actually do an in-conversation, which is quite a treat for me because normally it's Damon who gets to ask the questions. So tonight it's me being able to ask the questions. So good evening, Damon, and welcome.
Thank you. You've been waiting for this for a while.
I certainly have. So Damon, you often like to refer to your subjects familial relationships. So a question for you. What was it like to follow in your famous father's footsteps in journalism? And do you think the Kitney name opened doors for you that otherwise would not have opened?
That's an interesting question, Carol. I will say, and I think my father's on the thing here. It's funny, when I was growing up and going through university, I went to ANU in Canberra and actually studied law. I didn't study journalism. Dad and I never talked about journalism at all. In fact, as a lot of people would know, he was one of the best political journalists that's ever been. And I remember every day I had 4 newspapers on the breakfast table each morning, and I remember in the evenings having all the news services, and you'd never seen the news till you'd seen the ABC, which is the motto which many people still live by. But yeah, we just never really talked about it. And then as I went through uni, I got an interest in journalism, and I was lucky enough, and I must thank him, the former Fairfax CEO, Greg Highwood, actually gave me my first job in the Perth bureau of the Financial Review, which was pretty daunting, but because Perth's my hometown, it was really exciting. But it was really funny over there because Dad's from Perth and so is Mum, and we've got a lot of extended family there. And in that first 6 months, I just got sick of every time I picked up the phone. They were, "Are you Jeff's son? Are you Jeff's son?" And after a while, I actually said, "Yes, so," or "Why?" But look, it was actually an honour to get that. In fact, Kim Beazley was actually the federal opposition leader at the time there, and I had to deal with him, and he and Dad had a very close relationship for a number of years. And I remember when I'd ring up Kim's press secretary, I would hear a phone pick up, must have been at the other end of the place, and Kim would jump on the line and he'd say, "How are you going?" And I was like, "Oh, here he is." And he'd always say, "How's your dad going? How's your dad going?" So it was, you might say, a bit of a burden for a while, but I think for me, coming to Sydney 3 years later, and Glenn Burge, the then editor of the Financial Review, invited me to come to Sydney, very persuasively. Invitation is probably the wrong word. And he said, "I want you to go into the company section." And I think in terms of getting that separation from Dad's career, that was really important to go into business journalism. And I guess I haven't really looked back from that. I did have to cover quite a lot of politics when I was in Perth, and I must say I'm very glad to be away from it. And that's why I've developed my career in business journalism. Dad and I did cross paths later, actually, though, at the Financial Review when we were both working there for a time. And I do remember editing one Sunday newspaper. There used to be a roster, and I was one of the deputy editors, and I'd have to edit the newspaper on a Sunday. And that day, Dad was in the Canberra bureau, and he was running the bureau. And I remember he was pushing this story really hard to get off page 1, but I didn't put it on page 1. And I remember the next morning, I got a very terse text from him saying, "You buried my story." So it was quite funny how things were turned. But yeah, but it's funny, since that time, we talk quite a bit about journalism when we get together now. And my book on James Packer that I did a couple of years ago, Dad played a really important role in the editing of that, which I'm forever grateful for. And in particular, teaching me to stand back from the many weeds that there were in that experience, and to be able to get some perspective. So I would never say the Kitney name has necessarily opened that many doors, because it's been a completely different world that I've been in from Dad's. But I think just having the credibility of the Kitney name has always been important. I think when people see Jeff Kitney, they know what that stands for, and hopefully, that's rubbed off on me.
That's great. And it sounds like having a shared profession with your father has its advantages anyway, in the roles that he can play in terms of helping you, notwithstanding you both write in completely different areas. Although
Definitely.
I must say there's very often a crossover between business and politics.
Mm.
So I won't ask you whether your fathers and your politics are the same.
No, I don't think we should go there.
No, I won't get that controversial. So, Damon, what question do you ask when you interview someone to which you most often get the response, "I don't want to answer that question"?
Look, it depends on the context. I will say, which is sort of obvious, I guess, but children is always a very difficult area when you are asking people about their children. And in some situations and in some of the interviews in this book, that's been a very important issue to discuss, particularly where there's been a struggle in the family or an illness or an issue. You sort of feel you have to go there. With some subjects, you obviously discuss that beforehand to get them comfortable. But I'll tell you about one of the stories in the book where children register, hugely, which was a complete surprise. And it's the interview with Greg Roebuck, the CEO of car sales for many, many years. And that interview just came up completely out of chance. In fact, it was Greg's sort of final period at car sales, and it was just a pretty standard exit interview, to be honest, if I can call it that. And once we sat down, we were just sitting in Greg's office there in Richmond at car sales, and he just started opening up about these things that I really didn't expect. And in particular, anybody that's read the story will know he talked all about his relationship with his daughters and how difficult being a full-time CEO was for that relationship, and how, one of his daughters actually lectured him about the fact that he spent more time mentoring his work people than he did her, which was incredibly confronting, I must say. And for a while, I wondered whether he would want to go there, but he actually opened up further about it, which was to his great credit. And so when I was writing that story, I felt quite a responsibility to make sure that, everybody was respected and that it was presented accurately and fairly, because things like that can really go awry. And then to Greg's great credit, I remember Michelle Gunn, the weekend editor of The Australian, said to me, I would love to get a photo of Greg with those daughters of his. And again, that's completely taboo, you would think, particularly in this day and age. And I sort of rang Greg up and said, I asked him the question, fully expecting a response. And he just said, yep, when you want to do it. And the photo I will always remember was just one of the best photos I've had with one of my stories. They were just sitting in the park round from Greg's house at sunset, and it was just a really beautiful shot. So that was an example of where it did work. I think, obviously, back to your question, marriages and relationships is always a fraught area, particularly where you're aware that there's been a difficult issue for the subject. I do remember in the interview with Eloise Weislitz, which was a really amazing interview, and I'm forever thankful for her for the openness that she showed in that discussion. But it was very much the elephant in the room that day about her split with Alex. It had been in gossip columns in the newspapers, and here I was sitting with her, and it was so hard to ask the question. But I think Eloise had been well prepared or had jumped ahead of me, and she just volunteered it in the discussion that they'd broken up, which was like, well. So to her great credit, she was prepared to face the elephant in the room there. And then there's been other situations where, relationships have come up. I remember in Leon Zweier's interview, he, was quite happy to tell a great anecdote about his ex-wife and forgetting their wedding anniversary, which you can see in the book. That was actually quite amusing. So yeah, they're probably the two things, Carol, that I find are very hard to get answers on. Sometimes if you ask a question about something that's been very controversial or very difficult, people will, clamp up. I'll tell you one question I do find is a killer in every interview that you do, and sometimes it gets some amazing responses, is what is your greatest weakness? It often stumps people, and some of the responses you get there are incredibly, sometimes incredibly self-deprecating, self-analysing. So I remember in the interview with David Crawford, I remember he just laughed and said to me, Damon, I've got so many, which for such a strong corporate power player for so long was incredibly humbling that he would say that, and you can see that sort of is explored in that story. So, yeah.
So it sounds like for a lot of people that you interview, it sounds almost like a cathartic experience, or like a session with a psychiatrist, rather than with a business journalist. And I wonder, do people ever bring minders into the interviews, and how does that sort of dynamic work when there is somebody in there who's looking to protect the subject?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. It's been a cross-section, I must say, over time. In some interviews, the minders have been incredibly important. I think just to reassure the subject that, you know, everything's going to be okay. To their great credit, often in those interviews where they're deeply personal, I've had minders sit through them and not say a single word for the whole thing, which is to their great credit. And it shows a great level of trust, not only in me, but in the person they're advising, that they're prepared to do it. And there's been times over the years with minders where you share an experience together, and I'll never forget interviewing Anthony Pratt, which is in the book in 2010. And it was a very stressful interview because it was the first one that he had done since his father's passing the year before. There's a big build up to it. As I say in the book, it took 18 months basically of sort of courting him to get him to agree to sit down. But as is the way in the Pratt world, this happened on a private jet flying between two cities in America. And it was at the end of a couple of days of travelling around his mills and having dinner with him and whatever. And we were all waiting for this interview. But I remember at the very end of the interview, I said and it was a hard interview. We talked about a lot of controversial subjects, as you'll see in the book. And I said to him at the end of the interview, what was the last thing you said to your father? And he just looked at me and he said, I told him I love you. And I said, how did he respond? And Anthony just looked at me and he said he couldn't. He just squeezed my hand. And I remember looking at the two advisors that were with me, and they were almost in tears. And it just showed me the power, I guess, of the relationships in these, particularly these family companies. And these were guys that have worked with him for a long, long time. And I should have said that the lead up to that was when I actually went to Anthony's mansion in Atlanta on that trip as part of the going around with him. I'll never forget the image that was on the mantelpiece when I walked into the corridor, and it was a photo of Richard Pratt with only hours left in his life. And it's a photo the public haven't seen, but it was, and Anthony was with him basically on his deathbed with his young son, Leon, and they were smiling for the camera with their grandfather. And I'll never forget that image. And I guess when I asked that question on the plane, that image was very much, it was very much in my head. So,
yeah, fascinating. So when people agree to talk to you, Damon, are they expecting an interview where they share these very intimate, personal parts of their lives, or are they expecting to talk about their professional lives? And have you ever gone into an interview and somebody has sort of stopped you and said, no, I'm not going to talk to you about my personal life. You're a business journalist and I'm here to talk to you about my business?
Yeah, look, I think I think she's kindly on here and she's in the book, Nora. I remember, she was very clear and definitive early on that she did not want to talk about her private life, and I totally respected that. And you'll see in the interview as it's written, which is an interview I'm very proud of, because she was incredibly open about a lot of things in her business life, but she just said, I don't want to talk about it. And I had to respect that, and to her great credit, we went ahead with the interview and it ended up being a great outcome, but it showed a great deal of trust. But no, there are others where I think we've gone into the interview with the knowledge that there was a very big private issue that had to be explored. And I guess, one of the most significant ones in that was the Cowan family story in there, which involved a great tragedy, the death of Ben Cowan, the son of the former Governor General, in a paragliding accident on the Great Ocean Road in summer a few years back. And the premise of that story was really talking about the investment bank that he founded and how his business partners and his widow sort of recovered from that. But you knew that it was impossible to do that interview without talking about that day. And I do remember we just did it in their office in Collins Street, and we talked a bit of business first and whatever, but you had to get to the elephant in the room. And I remember Jason Ellenport actually reaching out his hand to Lara Carey as we were talking about Ben, and you could just see the emotion between them in that room. And I guess it brought back so many memories for them to talk about that experience. So that was a great example, I guess, of where we were there for a business premise, but the elephant in the room was the personal, and it had to be addressed. Kathryn Fagg, who's in the book there, was an amazing interview about her battle with breast cancer. And I didn't know Kathryn very well at all. I got an introduction to her, and I think, Carol, you assisted with that kindly. And Kathryn actually said, well, let's meet for lunch before we did the interview. So we had a nice, relaxed lunch down at Il Solito Posto, and we sort of just ran through, well, what will we talk about? And I guess as the coffees came, I sort of raised the elephant in the room. I said, do you want to talk about your breast cancer battle? And Kathryn just looked at me and she said, yes, I do. Yes, the time's come for me to tell my story. And I was like, wow. And so when we did the interview, it was there with that premise. And yeah, that was incredibly emotional. And when she was talking about her mother, and you'll see in the way that story is led, it was quite moving, talking about the last things that her mother said to her and whatever. So, I mean, some of these experiences can, as hard as they are for the subject, they can be quite draining for the questioner at times. And it's hard not to get sort of involved in it. But yeah, you've got to maintain your professionalism. And I do know whenever I come out of an interview like that, I'm literally shaking with anticipation that you have an incredible story, but also you have an incredible responsibility to tell that story accurately and fairly and responsibly. And yeah, I mean, it's an amazing privilege, but also, it's quite a challenge at times when you think about that. That I guess, what you've been entrusted with as such.
Well, I remember, Damon, when you came on a trade mission to Israel with us, and I remember we did the morning trip to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, where Alan and I spoke about Alan's family's experience through the Holocaust. And I remember at the end of that session, you came up and you just gave me the biggest hug, which I'll never forget. It was very warm, very emotional, and you were really there, part of the experience with us. So I can imagine that you are very empathetic when you're dealing with those very personal issues with others. Damon, but you've given us a couple of examples of, with Kathryn and the Cowan family, but which was the hardest interviews that you had to write, and why?
I think the hardest ones are sort of a standout. would be the first interview with James Packer in 2017. So that happened in October that year. It was complete luck, I guess, that it came through. I won't bore you with all the details of it, but just a great example of being in the right place at the right time. And the newspaper very kindly, when I rang up Helen Trinker and Paul Whitaker and said, James Packer's agreed to be interviewed, they couldn't get me on the plane fast enough. And so I had to fly to Argentina, because I did say to James, where do you want to meet? And he said, well, I'm not leaving Argentina for the next year, so you better come here if you want to speak to me, otherwise bad luck. So, yeah, I had to travel over there overnight. But it was funny with that, because there were so many questions in the public domain about what had happened to him for the previous couple of years. And where do you start? It was Mariah Carey, it was what was going on in Israel, the fights with his sister, Crown staff arrested in China. There was just so many issues to air that had not one hearing. And to be honest, when I turned up in Argentina, and I don't mind saying, Mark Arbib came with me. Again, this Minder situation that you talked about, Carol. But when I rocked up there, I just had so low expectations, to be honest, of what I would get, because it was just all so dynamite. I actually was sort of thinking I may come away with very little. But again, it's sort of, you've got to, there's tactics, I guess, in this, if I could put it crudely. And the night I arrived, we had a dinner. And to Mark's great credit, he sort of just left James and I to talk. And we talked for 2 hours over dinner, over, how many cigarettes I'd lost count of. And I was completely jet lagged, but having that conversation with him where he just basically just let rip about everything. So, and that was off the record, but it just gave me everything basically there that I knew that I needed to get on the record. Now, it was very hard to get some of that on the record, but to have that conversation that night really laid the groundwork for the next day. And I think it probably helped James as well. I think he got a lot of things out of his system that night in a situation where he knew that he wasn't going to be quoted every word. But that still didn't make the interview the next day any easier, and it was really hard work, and he was completely stressed out for the first hour. I remember it was just, I wasn't getting much. It was just hard work, and in those situations, you just got to be patient, I guess. One advantage of being on a ranch in Argentina is there isn't anywhere else to go or anything else to do. So, we just sat there for hours basically until we went through all the issues. And the extra stress of that in the writing was the deadline was incredibly tight to meet the magazine deadline. So I had to basically stayed in a hotel in Argentina in Buenos Aires the next night and just had to bash it out. But I just knew I had so much material; it sort of wrote itself, really. But that was a real challenge. There's a couple of other ones in there that I found sort of difficult to write. The piece with David Crawford, I remember, was quite hard because it was a difficult time for David. He'd been through some difficult situations with public companies that were taken over, in particular Foster's, and there was a lot of criticism of him. So I had to, I guess, air a lot of dirty laundry, if that's the right term. But then weaving that through with the personal, trying to draw out his character, that was really hard to sort of weave the personal and the business together. And that can be a real challenge in situations like that. So, and as I mentioned earlier, the Anthony Pratt interview was it was a great outcome, but it was hard work. It was hard work. So,
and Damon, who have been some of the most interesting non-Australians that you've interviewed?
In the world of Richard Branson, I've been very lucky to have interviewed two of his global executives and Branson himself, I must say. And I must with all due respect to what he's done in business, Richard was one of the hardest interviews I've ever done because it had all been written. There's just been so much written about Richard Branson. Trying to find an original angle is virtually impossible. And I don't blame him, the number of journalists he has to deal with and put up with in his life. But the day that I met him, you could see he was just like going through the motions. And it was actually for his charity Virgin Unite that we were doing the story. And we went out to a basketball stadium actually in southeast Melbourne to see some Sudanese kids that were playing basketball. And so Richard gave him a top and whatever, and I drove around with him in the car, and then we finally did the interview at the airport before he had to fly out. And he just had zero interest in being there. So it was just really, really hard. And I've actually heard that he is an introvert at heart, even though he plays the great extrovert. And you could see it in his character that day. And even at that airport interview, he was quite an introverted person. But I would say that I did get one angle out of him that he hadn't said before, only one, which was that he wanted one of his children to succeed him. He had never actually said that before. So,
how many children does he have?
Oh, two, I think. I'll have to go back and check it, son and a daughter. But on the good side of the Branson Empire, like I've interviewed both two of his last CEOs, and including the current one, Josh Bayliss, who's playing a bit of a role in this current Virgin Australia situation. And he's just a young New Zealander who's been in Switzerland running Branson's empire for a long time. But that was an absolutely fascinating interview. And if I had another 10 interviews I could put into this book, I would put him in there because it was really interesting, and particularly to talk about how he learnt and related to Richard, pulling all the strings behind the scenes.
Is there any one Australian business person that you haven't interviewed yet that you would love to interview?
Well, I'll do two hypotheticals first. There's two people I would love to have interviewed, but I never got the opportunity and I never will. And one of them is Richard Pratt and one of them is Kerry Packer. Having known their two sons so well, I think if I had have interviewed either of them or both of them, I would know their sons better. And it's funny, there are moments in life that you recall. I remember going to Alex Weislitz's 50th birthday, I think it was. And Richard Pratt was actually standing across the room on his own with a glass of red wine. And it's one of those moments I thought, right, here's my chance to meet Richard Pratt. And then someone grabbed me on the shoulder and 20 minutes later he was gone because he didn't hang around at those things very long. And so, that would have been a chance to at least said hi. And with Kerry Packer, I was assigned when I was at the Fin Review to chase him out of the PBL meeting with a tape recorder under his face with 20 other tape recorders. So that wasn't a very intimate way to meet him. But I do remember James Packer when I used to go and have a lunch with him at Park Street, which we'd do a few times a year, which was always off the record and was to James's great credit. He was prepared to lunch with a journalist. But one time when I was in the lift going up to the dining room, he looked at me and he said, "If Dad gets in this lift, you're not an effing journalist, okay?" So it was, he was very wary of his dad finding out that he was actually meeting a journalist. So, yeah.
And what about a living Australian?
Yep. So, well, there's two that I would just extend from that. I think Ros Packer and Jean Pratt would be just amazing interviews to do for all those reasons I outlined. But I just think what they have done for their families, is just incredible. And the fortitude that they've shown through all the difficulties and the challenges. In fact, it was one of the great regrets of my book on James Packer that I was all set to talk to his mother, to her great credit. In fact, I had an email exchange with her. And then, unfortunately, as is well public now, James had a big turn and he basically disappeared. And Went to a rehab clinic in Boston, which is all public, and after that I just felt it wasn't appropriate to bother Ros, to be honest, and I left her alone. It just became too hard. So, but look, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of people on the rich list. I guess, you know, you love to interview, and particularly I think I do love interviewing patriarchs and matriarchs, excuse the term, who started it all or you know, built it all, because their stories are just incredible. They speak with incredible openness. They don't answer anybody but themselves and their family, really. And they're always really special when you sit down and talk to those people. There's a few of them in that book, you know, that are the actual patriarchs or matriarchs. So it's pretty cool.
And well, that's quite interesting, because what do you think the difference is between the older generation and the younger generation of wealthy business people that you meet?
Oh, look, and I think on the family side of it, the youngest siblings and younger sons and daughters, they can find wealth a burden. I think sometimes it can be difficult for them to carry a name or to carry a tradition or carry on a business. And some have found that hard. And I think, you know, talking to David Fox in that interview that he did, which, you know, that's the first and last time I think David will ever do an interview, but you could see with him, you know, with a giant of a father like Lindsay Fox, I think, you know, he's found it challenging, but, you know, the affection that he showed for his father in that interview, and I know how close they are. Like, yeah, it was quite incredible. And I think there are the sort of the younger generation that have created their own wealth, and, you know, the Cannon-Brookses in the book are a great example of that. The thing I was most struck by doing that interview was actually just rocking up to their house in Centennial Park, and I remember it was a beautiful afternoon, and just rocked up to the gate, no security, no padlock, no nothing. Just opened the gate, walked straight in the front yard. On the grass was a kids' play equipment, which looked like it had, you know, come from Bunnings. And when Annie Cannon-Brookes answered the door, she was just in bare feet with a baby in her arms, and her husband came around, you know, 10 seconds later with a pair of thongs and his trademark cap, and we sat in the lounge room and or the sitting room, and there was still all these blow-up Star Wars figures around the room from the kids' birthday party the day before. So that was sort of quite amazing to sort of see the accidental billionaires, if you can call them that, in their own world. And we talked, as you'll see in the book, at length about, you know, wealth and what it meant to them and whatever. And obviously it was a pretty nice house, and they bought even better since then. But yeah, it was just a different way of doing things, I guess. And then, you know, the older wealth, it's always sort of quite regal, I guess, when you see some of the mansions that you visit people in. And Brian White, the patriarch of Ray White Real Estate, when I went and saw him, nicest guy, and unexpectedly his wife joined us for the interview, and she was just fantastic. She got stuck into him during the interview about things that he'd done in his life and stuff. I had to defend him at times, I think, but they gave me a tour of their Point Piper mansion, which is just, you know, mind blowing. And that's, you know, that's where they live. But yeah, just seeing the different parts of these people was incredible. But I'll never forget that day. Again, a story of family wealth, you know, because that is a multi-generational situation. And Brian started talking about his son that runs the business now, coming and showing him a video. And he'd gone back to where the White family started. His great-grandfather started in Toowoomba at the shed there that they started. And it's still there now. and he had a video taken of himself talking about how important his great-grandfather was and how he wanted to follow in his footsteps. And Brian just broke down talking about it. He just said that makes you feel so strong that you have a son that thinks of the family tradition in that way and, worships it, I guess, and wants it to be part of his business. Those sorts of stories are just so powerful, I think. And I guess that's why I love writing about family business, because, you just can't go past a story like that and an empire that's been built that exists today.
Yeah, the stories are powerful and you write about them beautifully. Emma, I feel like I've been hogging Damon's time, and I feel that I should share the platform for people to ask questions. Do you want to ask if anyone's got questions?
Oh, yeah, we've had a few questions coming in. I'll start with a question from Simon, who's asked, what's the best Australian business/business model that you've had the chance to get to know better through your interviews?
Business or business model? Yeah. I'd have to think about ones through the book. I'd have to, the question's pressing it, because I'd have to put Ray White right up there in terms of how they've been such a successful business and handed it through the generations, and doing that succession is quite remarkable. At the other end of the spectrum, I guess you look at a few people in there like Hamish Douglass at Magellan, an amazing success story, a real powerhouse, $100 billion of funds under management. And Hamish, again, that interview was actually conducted on the phone, believe it or not. We couldn't get together in person to meet the deadline, and which was disappointing in some ways. But to Hamish's great credit, he was very open, and we talked about a few things he'd never really talked about before. But I think that it's just a standout business, Magellan. One that's not in the book that flies right under the radar, which I have had a chance to interview both the patriarch and his son, is Reece Plumbing, which has been one of the great Australian success stories that flies completely under the radar. And the only way you can interview those people is going to the AGM and sticking a tape under them and talking to them, because they're so private. But that's just been an incredible story of success that's been handled down the generations, and you can just look at their performance. They've really been incredible.
Great, thank you. We've had several more coming through now, so to everybody sending them, thank you so much. We'll get through as many as we can in the remaining time. Natasha asks, what is one question that you would have asked Kerry Packer?
One. That's hard to narrow it down. Oh, look, if I was going to be really provocative, I would have. It would be a two-part question. I'd say, what do you really think of your son? And secondly, why were you so hard on him? I think they would be very appropriate questions to ask him, because going through the process of doing that book on James, I really... James never said it himself. To his great credit, he eulogises his father in his memory, which is, to his credit. But I think Kerry Packer was very, very hard on James, and I think there are a lot of things in his life that can be traced back to that relationship. He loved his son dearly. I could tell that in so many different ways, but sometimes I think he really harmed him without even knowing it. So I think that would have been a real killer question to have asked him.
Danny asks, what's the most surprising discovery in a person that you've made, who you've interviewed for the book?
That's a hard one. A few things have sort of just accidentally come out, I guess. I mean, I think the Greg Roebuck story I told earlier was a great example of where it was just a a routine interview that turned into this incredible story that I knew nothing about in terms of his relationship with his daughters, who he's incredibly close to, but just to be so open about, the challenges of being a corporate parent as such. I don't know. I'd have to think a bit more about that one. I think there's a story in there with Barry Irvin, the head of Bega Cheese, which was an incredibly moving interview. But I'd heard that Barry had cancer, and obviously that was one of the premises of doing the interview. But I never realised just how many twists there were to that story, and his father having cancer, and the amazing story, which is one of the most powerful I think I've ever had the privilege to tell, of his autistic son, that I sort of knew about from one sentence in a newspaper article. And for him to open up to tell me about how they communicated and how they would, he couldn't speak, and that they would press their foreheads together to communicate, and how you tell a son that you've got cancer when they can't understand you. It was just floored me how open Barry was about that. And I, forever to his credit, the fact that he was prepared to tell that story in public. And it's one of the pieces I'm most proud of. So.
Great, thank you. Stuart has asked, which interview in the book, if any, fills you with regret and why?
I don't think any fill me with regret. It's probably the wrong emotion. Look, some were difficult in terms of, just in the writing it was quite hard. And I mentioned the David Crawford one earlier. That was challenging in a real difficult situation. If I had my time over, I wouldn't change it. But I know it was sort of challenging at the time. But I think, if thinking through all those subjects, I don't think there was anybody that's ever come to me and said that they felt that I treated them unfairly. I think there were quite a few people who were a bit stunned by how graphic it was, or how open it was, or how open they were. But I think they respected the way that I presented them, and warts and all, I guess, at the end of the day. I guess there's some pride in the fact that as difficult as some of those stories are to be in the public domain, I think people respected the way that I told them.
What do you think of the criticism of the way that the media portrays business people?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think there are some amazing personal stories to tell in our business community, and that's what I'm trying to do through this book. I think too often we tend to lose sight of those, and we get so obsessed with share prices and numbers and strategy and whatever, we forget that there are human beings that run our companies. Sometimes those human beings do the wrong thing, and when they do that, they should be absolutely held to account to the full force of the law. But I do think that that there sometimes isn't an appreciation for what some of these business people have done, and I say that particularly in the private domain. One of the things I specialise in my journalism is private companies, because I think so often, and it's right, we obsess in business journalism about listed companies, particularly the big ones. Everybody's super is in them, so it's perfectly logical. But we forget sometimes that some of the best companies in the country are private. The biggest companies in the country are private. And it often gets lost, I think. And that's a part of resourcing as well. When you don't have as many people to go around, you have to focus on what you can. But I think I've been very lucky in my career that I've been able to and allowed to develop a niche around talking to private people. And the other thing I'll say about that is private people are inevitably more open than public. A public company CEO is incredibly scripted, and that's just the way it is. They employ a lot of minders. They're very careful because they answer to a share market and continuous disclosure rules, which are even more stringent than they've ever been. A private, particularly a patriarch, as I said earlier, answers only to themselves and their family and their company. And often, because those people don't talk very often, it's almost a privilege for them in some ways to sit down and talk to a journalist who's actually going to listen to them and speak to them. Some of them have never done it before. So often you find in those situations the amount of stuff you actually come out with is it's mind-blowing. So, and that's really exciting.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question, and it's from Bedri. And Bedri asks, what's the best boat / plane / mansion / ranch that you've ever conducted an interview at?
Right. Well, I will say, to just take from the premise of that question, some of these interviews were conducted in absolutely nothing locations, in boardrooms without even a window, I think. And in fact, as I told you, the Hamish Douglas interview was done on the phone. So, but look, I think, it was pretty hard to go past going to Argentina that time, as stressful as it was. Like seeing James Packer's Ellistina property was, just amazing. And it is a very special place. And it's just so hard to get there that you really appreciate the fact that when you do, how far you've come. And look, I think, I think there's 4 members of the Pratt family that are in this book. Some of those were done in their houses, some were done in offices. They're lovely places to go to, obviously. But it's sometimes it's not about the place you go to. Obviously, it's all about the content. And I would say some of the best interviews have just come in boring boardrooms without even windows.
Lovely, thank you. So, because of the time, I might hand back to you both for any final comments and questions that you have before I open up to allow the audience to join me in thanking you both for what's been a really wonderful and insightful discussion this evening.
Thanks, Emma. The great questions from all the participants. So thank you very much, everybody. Damon, are there any final remarks that you would like to make?
Well, I do want to, Carol, just most of all thank my newspaper for giving me the opportunity to write these stories and to publish them the way they have. And quite a few of them ran on page 1 of the newspaper. So I think that's very lucky that I've spent 10 years now with the Australian, and I'll just run through the names. That's Chris and Michelle, who are in charge now, and then John Lehman, Helen Trinker, and then Eric and Amber in the business pages. And then before them, I really want to pay tribute to Paul Whitaker, Chris Mitchell, Clive Matheson, Jeff Elliott, Georgina Windsor, and even Brett Clegg, who was my first business editor there. We came across from the Fin Review together. Those guys have all, and ladies have been very, very generous to me. And I obviously want to thank my wonderful family, both here in Melbourne, with my lovely wife Anna and my lovely children, who've put up with me travelling across the world to do these things, and travelling in private jets and whatever. And then I mentioned my wonderful parents earlier, who've supported me right through. So, couldn't have done it without them, obviously. And thank you all to you that have dialed in tonight. Over 100 people is very humbling. There's a lot of wonderful friends I know are on here, colleagues, people I've learnt from. It's just an absolute humbling experience for you to be on here and sharing this story with me. A lot of you have shared the journey, and we've all had ups and downs, but I'm just so glad that I can call you all friends. So thank you.
Well, I think I can highly recommend the book. I think that, as we all heard tonight, the way Damon approaches his interview subjects in such a human way and in such an empathetic way, I think that they open up in a way that they probably never expected that they would to a business journalist, but a business journalist extraordinaire. Thank you so much, Damon. Good luck with the book. And thank you, Emma, for a fabulous webinar. And I just commend everybody to go and buy the book. Thanks for attending, everyone.
Lovely. Thank you both so much. I'm going to take everybody off mute now so that you can join me in thanking Carol and Damon. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Well done.
Well done, Cass. Well done, Damon.
Well done, Damon.
Bye.
See you all. Goodbye.
Well done.
Well done, Mike.
Well done, Damon. Already got a copy. Brilliant. Good on you, Carol. Good on you, Alan.
Thanks for joining.